Hello, I'm Helen Sauntson. This talk is called Whose Equality Matters the Most? The Discourse Analysis of the Language of Pro and Anti-LGBTQ plus Inclusion in the Relationships and Sex Education Guidance for Schools in England. In this talk, I'm going to be focusing on anti-gender and sexuality diversity discourses within the UK. I'm specifically going to be exploring some discourses around the recently amended Relationships and Sex Education provision in schools in England, or RSE for short. The new provision is now inclusive of LGBT identities and relationships in the relationships aspect of the subject. Although there has been overwhelming support for greater gender and sexuality diversity in the curriculum, it has also been met with some resistance. And I'm interested in analysing what those who are opposed to inclusion have said about it. And this slide just sets a little bit of context for RSE provision in the UK. So it's devolved in the UK. There was amended guidance published in 2019 and implemented in 2020 that followed a 2-year review period. Prior to that, the guidance hadn't been amended since 2000, so it was well overdue. And the RSE guidance was revised following heavy criticism of the preceding version and a need for the guidance to incorporate relevant legal changes that had taken place over the preceding 2 decades, such as the Same-Sex Marriage Act and the Equality Act. So when we look at the new amended RSE guidance, we can see that despite the inclusion of diverse sexual relationships and LGBTQ plus identities, this actually only occurs in a small section, just 2 paragraphs, and the language that's used in these paragraphs is very vague. And that vague language means that the implementation by teachers is likely to be highly variable. So these are the 2 paragraphs in the guidance that refer to the inclusion of LGBT identities and relationships. As you can see, the paragraphs are very short. They refer briefly to adherence to the Equality Act, and then they devolve responsibility for the delivery of LGBT inclusion to schools. This means that the paragraphs are very open to interpretation and their delivery can be highly variable. As I'm going to be using critical discourse analysis to analyse the data, it's worth looking briefly at some relevant historical context in relation to how sexual diversity has been dealt with in RSE and in UK schools more generally. So in 1988, the UK Local Government Act made it illegal for homosexuality to be promoted, and that was the word that was actually used in section 28 of the Act in schools. And non-heterosexual relationships were explicitly described in section 28 as pretended family relationships. And this set the ground for providing RSE in schools which focused exclusively on heterosexual family relationships, and for creating and maintaining an absence or a silence around any other forms of sexual identities, relationships, and family structures. Now, Section 28 was in effect for quite a long time. It was finally repealed by the Labour government in 2003, but because it had been around for such a long time, there still appears to be a hangover or a legacy from Section 28, which has resulted in a pervading silence and a fear of openly discussing any non-heterosexual identities and relationships in schools. And this has been widely documented in the literature. And it's the persistence of this legacy that's been one of the driving forces behind the inclusion of LGBT identities and relationships in the new amended Relationships and Sex Education Guidance. But what we'll see shortly is that the rhetoric of recent school protests against LGBT inclusion sits alongside the language that was very reminiscent of the 1980s and of Section 28 in particular. So, since the publication of the guidance in 2019, some groups have mobilised against the inclusion of positive teaching about LGBT identities and relationships in the new guidance. And in May 2019, a number of public protests took place outside some primary schools in Birmingham. And these protests suggested that although there is across the country general overwhelming support for the new guidance, including the new section on LGBTQ identities, there are still some groups in society who are opposed to teaching about this particular dimension of equality. And even though these groups are a minority, these protests received a lot of attention in the media. They featured quite heavily in the national news at the time, for example. The opposition groups who staged these protests appear to be very skilled in using language to express discrimination against LGBTQ identities and relationships, but not in overt ways, actually in quite subtle ways, and that's what I'm interested in analysing. If you want to get a bit of a flavour of what the protests looked like and sounded like, please do click on the YouTube link here, and this will take you to a short video of one of the protests. Having set the context a little bit, my main research question then is, what are the key linguistic and discursive strategies used by the protest groups to distort progressive views of gender and sexuality within the UK school context? And how are these strategies countered by pro-inclusion groups? So I'm interested in analysing some of the language used by both sides of the argument, the anti-inclusion groups and the pro-inclusion groups, if you like. So I firstly use critical discourse analysis to analyse the talk used by the protest groups in some of the publicly available video recordings of the protests. And then I then turn to positive discourse analysis to analyse the language used in the website texts of some of the pro-inclusion groups. Here is some more information about the data then. So the anti-inclusion texts, as I'm calling them, consisted of 15 transcribed videos taken from YouTube on the same date when Birmingham school protests was used as a search term. There were a high number of views, as you can see, which provides evidence of the high public circulation of the videos in this data set. The pro-inclusion groups were not staging protests, so I had to turn to a different data source to try to analyse their language. So the second data set of the pro-inclusion texts, as I'm calling them, focuses on the website of the two most prominent pro-LGBT inclusion groups in the UK, who publicly challenged the views expressed by the anti-inclusion groups. And these organisations were called Schools Out, and Iman LGBTQ. Iman LGBTQ are a Muslim gay rights charity, and their work, as we'll see later on, has been particularly important for countering the views of the anti-inclusion groups. The websites will take you to the data and for more information about the pro-inclusion groups. I analysed the data using two related critical discourse analysis frameworks. I analysed the language of the protest groups using Van Dijk's CDA framework for categorising discrimination denial strategies. I then draw more directly on positive discourse analysis to analyse the language of resistance in the website texts of the pro-inclusion groups, who respond directly to the discriminatory discourse of the protest groups. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing the frameworks themselves, but I'm happy to take questions about them later. So starting with the critical discourse analysis, Van Dijk's discursive strategies of denial CDA framework was devised for analysing racist discourse, but I've applied it to discriminatory discourse focused on gender and sexuality, and it seems to work just as well. Jackson defines racism as a person's attitudes, beliefs and actions which can support or perpetuate racism, and these racist thoughts may be below the person's level of awareness. And racism can take the linguistic forms, according to Jackson and Van Dijk, as jokes, slurs, expressions of the inherent superiority of a racial group, and explicit denials of racism. And it's these denials that I'm particularly interested in terms of applying them to expressions of homophobia. Here then are Van Dijk's discursive strategies of denial. So this is the first framework I used. Over the next few slides, I'll provide a short definition of each strategy, along with some typical examples from the protest group data. For time purposes, I won't read out each example, but will leave you to read the examples yourselves. So Van Dijk's first strategy is a disclaimer, which involves the speaker explicitly denying that they are being discriminatory. So in my data set, it typically took the form of people saying things like, "I'm not homophobic, but," or words to that effect. And here are some examples. The second strategy is called reverse charge. This involves speakers in the protest groups accusing other people of being oversensitive, intolerant, and of preventing free speech. In other words, it involves the people who are being discriminatory actually arguing that the target group are the ones who are actually being discriminatory. So it reverses the charge against the actual target group. Quite a lot of the reverse charge examples in the protest group data set contained metaphors, and the metaphorical reverse charges were quite effective actually in enhancing a perception of threat. In this case, it was the perceived threat of LGBT inclusion in RSE. The metaphors centered around feelings and images that were to do with heaviness and weight, such as the bulldozer crushing our kids under the LGBT banners and people's morals being trampled over. The transfer denial strategy involves the speaker deflecting the discriminatory attitude away from themselves and making out that they're actually just speaking on behalf of other people who might be offended or threatened and so on. The defense discriminatory denial strategy involves the speaker making out that what they've said has been misread or that they didn't intend it in the way that it has been interpreted. The mitigation strategy involves playing down the perceived potential threat that might come along with any expressions of discrimination against a particular group. The justification strategy involves the speaker using language in a way which implies that they have a right to express their feelings, which may be interpreted as discriminatory by others. In this data set, quite a lot of the time, the speakers appealed to their right as a British citizen to be able to express their views, which were actually discriminatory against gender and sexuality diversity. The excused strategy involves the speaker claiming that there's a reason for them to express what might be interpreted as discriminatory, but they're doing it for the greater good in order to avoid something worse happening a little bit further down the line, usually to avoid potential conflict or tension. And then the final discursive denial strategy in Van Dijk's framework is provocation or victim blaming. And this involves the speaker directly or indirectly implying that it's somebody else's fault that they're having to speak out and express their views in this particular way. So in the case of the protest groups, they were blaming school teachers, head teachers, and also the LGBT community in Birmingham. This table provides a summary of the numbers of occurrences of each strategy across the data set. As you can see, the protest groups use the strategy of reverse charge the most frequently. Their denials most frequently took the form of claims that it was actually the LGBT community who were being discriminatory against the protest groups, primarily based on their religion. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why there was so much media attention around the protests and why the language they were using was so difficult to challenge. Anyone who openly resisted the protest groups actually ended up being at risk of being accused of being racist and or anti-Islamic. But as I said earlier, some groups did express resistance to the views of the protest groups through online channels such as their organisations' websites. Positive discourse analysis provides a systematic means of analysing the discourse of resistance. So I employed this particular framework when analysing the resistant discourse of the pro-inclusion groups. Now for this, I draw specifically on the recent work of Nati and Ananda, who have developed McGilchrist's positive discourse analysis concept of discursive reframing as a form of resistance. And McGill-Christ's definition of reframing is included here on the slide. Nati and Ananda propose three main discursive categories of reframing: the implied us versus them dichotomy, contrastive argumentation, and parallelism. And I identified these strategies being used in the websites of the pro-inclusion groups. So on the next few slides, I again provide brief definitions of each reframing strategy, along with illustrative examples from the data. And again, for time purposes, please just read through the examples by yourselves, and I'm happy to deal with questions about the examples at the end. So firstly then, the implied us versus them dichotomy as a discursive reframing strategy involves the use of othering and the implied construction of an in-group whose values are aligned with those of the author, and an out-group whose implied values are more ideologically and socially dominant than those of the in-group. So interestingly, in both the Schools Out and the Iman LGBTQ texts, they were constructing the protest groups of the other, and it was particularly interesting in the Iman LGBTQ text that they were presenting the protest groups as not fully representative of the Islamic community. The second reframing strategy is called contrastive argumentation, and this was probably used the most by the pro-inclusion groups on their websites. It's where the writer acknowledges an argument or a worldview that's presented by the other group, the other side, but then they counter it with their own. So this often takes the form of what's called a concession refutation structure. So the concession acknowledges the view expressed by the other group, but then the refutation presents a counter-argument which explains why that view that's expressed by the other group is essentially wrong. It was particularly interesting that on the Iman LGBTQ website, there's quite a large question and answer section, which basically takes the form of a concession refutation contrastive argumentation structure, which basically has the effect of, it enables the pro-inclusion group, so Iman LGBTQ themselves, to put forward an argument claiming that the views of the protest groups are actually wrong. Nati and Ananda's final discursive reframing strategy is parallelism, which refers to parallel structures in discourse, basically. And the rhetorical effects include things like the reinforcement of key themes and ideas, where they're repeated, reiteration, and emphasis. To sum up then, the anti-inclusion groups use a number of discursive denial strategies to legitimately express a viewpoint which marginalises and delegitimises LGBT identities. The most frequent discursive strategy used by the anti-inclusion groups is that of the reverse charge, although the strategies of disclaimer and defence are also reasonably common. What these strategies function to do is to move the focus away from the behaviour of the protest groups themselves and encourage greater scrutiny of those supporting LGBT inclusion in the RSE guidance. The pro-inclusion groups predominantly use a discursive strategy of reframing, particularly the contrastive argumentation strategy, to enact resistance to the ideologies constructed by the protest groups. Reframing works as a strategy which deconstructs the arguments which underpin the reverse charges and other strategies as well, deployed by the anti-inclusion groups. Reframing, therefore, emerges from the positive discourse analysis as a potentially powerful discursive strategy of resistance, which enables the pro-inclusion groups to progress their position and to move towards social change ultimately. What this analysis means is that there are conflicting discourses, therefore, of democracy and equality, which emerge from the data, with both groups claiming that the other one is being undemocratic and non-compliant with UK equality laws. The rhetoric of the anti-inclusion groups focuses very much around claims that equality law is not being upheld and therefore democratic values are being undermined through the inclusion of LGBT content in the school curriculum. But the pro-inclusion groups then refute this by refuting the religious basis of the claims that the anti-inclusion groups are building their arguments around. So whilst the anti-inclusion groups use language in ways that distort progressive views of gender and sexuality, the pro-inclusion groups find ways of using language to undermine this. So ultimately what we see is a discursive struggle around the very notions of equality and democracy, with both sides claiming that their right to equality matters the most. Thank you very much for watching.